Hello Submarine friends. I'm going to make a video today on how to make an electric penetrator for your submarine or ROV or whatever. This of course is all DIY stuff. We're going to use this fitting, which is a brass 3/8 pipe, 1/4 inch bore, barbed fitting. We're going to use household wire. This is number 14 solid core wire, and that's important. And that's going to go through the fitting and it's going to be epoxied in. So the first thing we have to do is we have to strip away some of the shielding on this wire. So all we're going to do is we're going to cut away about 3/4 of an inch of the plastic jacket, exposing the copper. And I just use a knife and I just cut it away. This will be embedded in the epoxy. And the reason we have to use this solid core wire, if you use a multi-strand wire, the water can actually travel down the strands. I know that because I've tried it and that's what happens. So there we have it. We have about 3/4 of an inch peeled back. And so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to sand that just to make sure that the epoxy really sticks to it. And there might be some kind of a coating on the copper from the manufacturing process we want to get rid of thoroughly. Okay, so I have both of these wires stripped back at least 3/4 of an inch, and what I'm going to do now, they've both been sanded thoroughly. Now I'm going to super glue these wires together so they stay nice and close together like this. So I just put it in my vise. And then I just take my super glue and I let that set up. Then we'll move on to the next step. These are glued together just the way we like it. The copper is spread apart enough and it's staying in place nicely. So what we have to do now is we have to prepare this fitting. So what we're going to do, we're going to run a tap inside this because the epoxy is going to be filling this void and I want the epoxy to grab onto something really thoroughly. So I'm just going to run a 7/16 fine tap inside this thing just to give us something to grip to. It's perfect. So now I want to clean this really well, just to make sure that the epoxy is going to stick. So I'm just going to take some acetone, put it on a rag. I also glued my fingers together very thoroughly. That should do it, just a precaution. Okay, now we move on to the next step. We feed these wires in. Now you see how I've spread it apart like that? I did that on purpose because I want the epoxy to coat everything. And so what it does, it also helps to center itself. So I'm going to slide that through. Now I want the copper part to end up just shy of this large void. So it has to be completely coated, but just. Now comes the next step. You put it in a vise so that we can silicone this top here to stop the epoxy from running right through. You have to use really good silicone. Don't cheap out on the silicone. So now we wait for this silicone to set up. Once it's set up, we can move on to the next step. Okay, so the silicone has set up a bit. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to flip this over ever so gently. And then pinch it back in here. What we have to do, we have to fill that with epoxy, but first, we want to make sure that we have no shorting out. So I'm just going to take my ohm meter. If it's shorting out, we'll have a signal from the wire end to the body. Nothing. Nothing. So we're good. Okay, so I have this plastic cup here I've cut down. I buy these 100 at a time for this sort of thing. And I just squeeze in some 5-minute epoxy. And then stir it all up. Don't like to do it all in one pour necessarily because this stuff goes off so quick. I really should use the slower acting epoxy. But as long as you do it in a couple of pours, seems to be okay. It can be pretty tricky to get it to travel down the wires. So what I do is I kind of just pour it onto the wires and let it run down. Give it a little bit of help. Try to make it so that there's always an air hole in the top so it doesn't get a void. You can see there's really nothing to this. And I've tested these to 1000 psi. No problem. Of course I got it on the threads. I really need to learn to cover the threads with tape. It just makes it easier so you don't have to clean up the epoxy off the threads. Okay, we'll let that set up and then we'll move on to the next stage. Okay, a few things to talk about here. This is a super simple, easy to make penetrator. Number one, you have to use solid core wire. If you use multi-strand wire, the water will actually travel through the plastic jacket, or between the plastic jacket and the copper, and it'll go between the strands and past the epoxy. So you have to use a solid core wire, and I like to sand it just to remove any oil or whatever may be on it. The other thing is, this is a shallow application penetrator, maybe to 350 feet. I'm sure it would survive 1,000 feet. If we threw this in the pressure chamber and ran it up to 450 pounds, it'd be fine. It wouldn't leak, but the safety margin's not there. If you're going to go deeper, you want to reverse this. You make it exactly the same, but instead of the large void being on the inside of the sub, you turn it around so the large void is on the wet side of the sub. This way, the epoxy has to push or extrude through a smaller opening. So it would be 3/8 on the outside and 1/4 on the inside. Obviously the epoxy can't push through unless there's massive pressure, and you would use stainless steel and whatnot. So when I said I made the penetrator for my deep diver the same way I made this, in principle I did. I stripped solid core wire and I epoxied it the same way, but my contact area is greater. So where this only has the plastic stripped away for 3/4 of an inch, I have got more exposure. I stripped away much more. My penetrator is much longer to accommodate that. Plus, of course, I have a substantial shoulder and my wires are smaller. Not that that's a huge impact, I don't think. So that's the difference. But if you're going shallow, this is a quick, easy, inexpensive penetrator to make. And you can put a hose on it, which is really nice because everything can be filled with oil and nice and safe from the water. So I hope you enjoyed that. To all of you who are subscribing, thank you very much. Ciao.